Yeah, do you want the microphone, Beverly?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I see you're all hiding at the back, and I have to say, I can't blame you. I'll try not to croak too badly, but I did want to at least honor Dr. Katie Starkweather with an introduction, okay? Abbreviated as it may need to be. Anyway, Dr. Starkweather is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She did a couple of awesome postdocs before joining the faculty at the University of Illinois. One of these was at the University of New Mexico with Melissa Emery Thompson. And then she also did a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany. Okay, her PhD is from the University of Missouri in 2016. Before that, she was doing a master's at the University of Nebraska, and she did her undergrad at West Texas A&M University. And a fun fact about Katie is that she has played college volleyball and has been a volleyball coach. I'm very impressed with the longitudinal study that she started in Bangladesh. It's called the Shodagor Longitudinal Health and Demography Project. And she initiated this in 2011. She's continued it over the years with a lot of dedication to longitudinal field work on such topics as life history theory, women's livelihoods, climate and environmental change, maternal and child health, and human behavioral ecology. I think she's really one of the up and coming human behavioral ecologists of the generation, maybe two generations after me. Seems to be fitting that I'm croaking. Katie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beverly. Thanks for having me here. I'm so excited to be here. I've never been to the University of Michigan before, so I've been really looking forward to this. And it's been really wonderful to meet and talk to so many people already today. All right, I'm going to talk about some of my work in Bangladesh, and hopefully I have all the right microphones on and click through things in the right way. We'll see. Oh, nope. Shoot. Huh. Oh, I know what the problem is. Okay. There. All right. I was seeing Zoom, which is not super helpful to me. Okay. All right. So let's start out with the premise that human mothers face an adaptive problem in that both the direct care and the resources that they provide are critical for the survival, growth, health, and well-being of their children. But the human life history pattern in which we stack multiple dependents on top of one another means that human mothers have multiple children at different stages of dependency who they need to provide care and resources for. And they need to do this or figure out how to do this in a way that supports their reproductive success, which I will define here as their ability to survive and reproduce and that of their offspring. And so this is a problem that has really deep evolutionary roots, as I'll talk about in just a minute, and is also a problem that women in contemporary human societies around the globe are facing. It's also a problem that has been and will continue to be exacerbated by climate change. So what should women do? How should women solve this problem? The economy of scale model of gender divisions of labor suggests that basically women should choose economic activities that allow them to care for children simultaneously, and that that's the best way to support their reproductive success. So in other words, the best thing for women to do is just do both things at the same time and everything will be fine. And so we know that while in general, that it is true that women do work that is compatible with childcare, that really only holds up when we think about women's work and compare it to the work that men typically do, right? Women do work generally that is more compatible with childcare than the work that men do. But it doesn't mean that their work is always fully compatible with childcare. And so I'm going to suggest that when we think about women, we compare women amongst each other and really think about work in general, whether it's women's work or men's work, on a spectrum, in which on one end of the spectrum, work is fully compatible with childcare, meaning that tasks can be done at the same time that children are being cared for, and that this presents relatively few trade-offs, right? There's not a big trade-off between the time that you spend working and the time that you spend in childcare. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have tasks that make it really difficult, if not impossible, to care for children at the same time. And I'll give some examples of this in just a second. But in this case, then, trade-offs are relatively high. You can spend your time working, but you can't also spend that time caring for children at the same time. So you basically have to choose to do one or the other. So examples of this variation look something like this. Something like food processing or foraging with infants is probably fully compatible with childcare, whereas things like hunting, which we know that women do in some contexts, or wage labor in sort of contemporary societies, are fully incompatible. Women cannot do these tasks and also care for children at the same time. And we expect that this variation is heavily based on environmental and potentially also cultural circumstances. For instance, local ecology seems to help explain why women hunt in some places but not in others. And the economy of scale framework suggests that as trade-offs between work and childcare increase, for women in particular, that reproductive success, which I will discuss here specifically as health outcomes for children, will decrease. And that that trading off between work and childcare should really be detrimental to reproductive success. And we should especially expect this to be the case when resources are really hard to come by, because subsidizing either childcare or resources will become increasingly difficult as this is true. And this is an issue that climate change has been contributing to. Climate change is contributing to resource scarcity around the world, and this disproportionately negatively impacts women and girls, and especially those in the global south, in a number of different ways. The Food and Agriculture Organization and the UN Women, both report that women in particular are working longer and harder to acquire the resources that their households need. So things like getting food, getting water, and getting firewood. And the same report from UN Women stated that women often increase their workloads in order to maintain livelihoods in response to extreme climate events like drought or flooding. And so as a result of these changes, women in the global south are likely to spend more and more time engaged in tasks that are incompatible with childcare and are requiring more and more trade-offs. And what we would expect based on this is that this will lead to increasingly worse health outcomes for children. So this is the problem that my research program is really focused around. I use an evolutionary framework and a mixed method study design to determine how environmental change and women's livelihoods interact to influence maternal and child health. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about 3 of the primary research questions that I'm working on in order to address this larger problem. So the first is, how do women's livelihoods adapt to environmental change? Second, how do environmental conditions interact with livelihoods and livelihood-related trade-offs to influence child health outcomes? And third, how will livelihood responses to climate change influence health outcomes? So to address these questions, I work with an ethnically distinct, traditionally semi-nomadic, boat-dwelling communities of Shodagor fishers and traders who live in rural Bangladesh. These communities are experiencing rapid lifestyle changes. So many families are moving out of the boats and into homes on the land. But these remain, as you can see in this picture here, really fairly precarious dwelling situations. They are a low-income, minoritized group, especially relative to the surrounding non-Shodagor communities, and are also particularly medically underserved compared to those communities. These communities of Shodagor people live in Matlab, Bangladesh, and I just want to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So Matlab has around 300,000 people living in it, and this at this time, as far as I know, this includes only around 500 Shodagor households. So they are a statistical, like very small minority of people in this community of Matlab. My work is primarily focused on around 200 Shodagor families who have lived on boats within the last 20 years, because these tend to be the most sort of medically underserved communities, but also the families most likely to continue practicing some of their more traditional subsistence behaviors. And these families live in 5 different locations throughout Matlab, either on or near the Donegota River, which is the main river that runs right through the middle of Matlab. Their diet consists primarily of rice, lentils, and fish, with occasional additions of other things like chicken, meat, sometimes vegetables, more and more processed foods as time goes on, but rarely things like fruit. The drinking water situation is not good. 28% of households report getting their drinking water exclusively from tube wells, which we know is a relatively clean water source. And 62% of households, this was back in 2014, so I assume that this number has increased, report getting at least some of their drinking water from the rivers, which have serious problems with contamination from lots of different sources. The economy is primarily a cash economy, but most households also practice some subsistence fishing on a regular basis, meaning that they eat at least some of the fish that they catch, usually at least once or twice a week. 95% of men in the population fish as their primary occupation for at least half of the year. And women are split almost 50-50 between 2 different occupations. And these are the 2 primary income earning occupations or resource getting occupations that are available to Shodagor women, which are fishing and trading. And since my research questions are really centered around women's livelihoods and their interaction between environmental circumstances and health, I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what these 2 different occupations look like and generally why you should care. Or in other words, why they're helpful for my research. So around 45% of women fish as their primary occupation. They almost always do so with their husbands, and they almost always take their children of all different ages onto the fishing boat with them. They use nets, and they also primarily use hook and line technology when they're fishing. 53% of women, or around about there at any given time, are working as what they call traders. Basically, they are going door to door out into the villages and trading or selling these goods, household goods, things like bowls, plates, pitchers, cooking utensils that they carry on their heads in really big, heavy baskets. They're selling these directly to non-Shodagor women. They work in groups with other women, and these are, trading and fishing both result in long, physically demanding days, but in sort of really different ways. These women tend to be gone from home from usually around 8 in the morning until sometimes up until 10 o'clock at night. They typically do this 5 to 6 days of the week for about 6 months out of the year. So this is a really intensive and physically intense occupation. These occupations are really interesting for lots of reasons, but they're associated with some important differences, including differences in the economic risk that's associated with them, such that trading, what this tells you here, I'll point at both of these if I can get it. No, I can't. Trading is associated with higher risk of losing money, but it also has the potential for you to make more money than fishing, which tends to produce maybe slightly less resources on average, but very reliable resources, meaning that if you go out fishing, you are highly likely to come back with at least something, right? And even if it's not something that you can sell and make some good money off of, at least your family has something to eat, as opposed to trading, where you can go out trading for the day. If you have anything get stolen from you, if you lose it, break it, sell it for less money than it's worth, you can end up losing money on the day. And so this is an unusual gendered dynamic here. Trading is also associated with some economic benefits, including higher income on average. Sorry, these are supposed to have little more dots to show you the actual data, but just believe me, trading is associated with higher income and also greater household wealth. There are fertility differences. I messed up on my numbers earlier. So the total fertility rate for women over the age of 60 is 4.5. These are some data that were modeled in a paper that just came out a few weeks ago, what this figure is showing you, that as women increase market activities, which in this case is trading, their fertility tends to decrease. And so in these older populations, trading women have an average total fertility rate of 3.8, and fishing women have a total fertility rate of 5. There are also important differences, and this is really where the rubber meets the road here, in compatibility with childcare. So trading is totally incompatible with childcare. Women do not take kids trading with them. And in fact, they report over and over again that if they don't have anyone to take care of their kids for the day, they just can't go to work. As opposed to fishing, in which women and their husbands are taking kids of all ages, from basically 2 or 3 months old, up through teenage years, with them on the fishing boats. So despite these differences, both types of livelihoods are also inextricably linked to the local environmental conditions. And so things like seasonality and extreme weather have major impacts on all types of Shodagor households. The Shodagor lifestyle, living on boats or in homes that are close to the banks of the rivers and the canals, means that they feel the effects of the larger climatic changes that are affecting, the entire country. This is also a relatively small country geographically, and so a lot of these experiences are relatively ubiquitous. Bangladesh has a tropical climate in which, for the Shodagor purposes, there is a rainy season and there is a dry season, and the patterns of temperature and rainfall generally look something like this, in which temperatures tend to peak in April and May, and then rainfall tends to peak around July and maybe sometimes into August. And so you have, approximately 6 months out of the year where large portions of the landscape are, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. I don't want to steal my own thunder here. So there's seasonal flooding that's associated with the rainy season. This is some really cool data. This graphic was created by a geographer that I've recently started to work with, in which they are calculating the fraction of flooded area in Bangladesh between 2017 and 2022. And one thing that's really interesting here is that you might briefly look at this and say, why is there a bimodal distribution every year, in which, there seem to be 2 sort of peak flooding periods, or 2 peak periods of inundation. And the second peak is due to the fact that this is a largely agricultural economy, that these seasons and the seasonal floods that are associated with them support this agricultural economy, such that once the rains sort of dissipate and the landscapes the flooding starts to recede, people pump water into their agricultural fields from the river to flood their agricultural fields so that they can then engage in rice agriculture. Okay. And while this is not maybe the best geographical representation here, I just want to give you a really good idea about what things actually look like during the rainy season. So the rainy season is, lasts approximately 6 months out of the year. And this is due to rainfall, but it's also due to Himalayan snowmelt. And so sometimes if you get much hotter temperatures throughout South Asia earlier in the year, you might have flooding start earlier, or sometimes vice versa. In Bangladesh, since it is very, very close to sea level in terms of elevation, has these floodplains that cover a large majority of the country. Matlab is located right here, right in the middle of the Meghna River floodplain. And so they experience regular seasonal flooding every year. It used to be something that was highly predictable. And when this happens, basically all of the low-lying areas in the region are just completely covered in water. So this includes, fields, but it also includes footpaths and auxiliary roads, and it makes travel to a lot of, especially the more remote villages, very challenging. Let me give you an idea about what this looks like in the Shodagor communities. Let's see here. Most Shodagor houses are situated within some of the lowest lying areas of the floodplain, right up against the banks of the rivers or the canals. And so during the rainy season, the areas in between the houses will often flood and end up being totally covered in water. And so you don't have a lot of land available for things like communal gatherings or even basic socialization. And in many cases, people actually need to use small country boats to get between houses or between houseboats and houses. So I wanted to show you this picture, not only because it's cute, but also because this area where these two little girls, it's deep enough for these little girls to swim in, is exactly the same as this area in the dry season. So there is a major, major difference in terms of the landscape and the usability of land in the Shodagor communities, but also in Matlab more generally. Here's another picture from the dry season. And during the rainy season, these areas up here will be totally inundated and covered in water. And these are also the areas that people are trying to build up higher and higher with more sand and dirt in order to build houses on them, which sort of contributes to the precarity of their living situation. Bangladesh is also dealing with variable instances of extreme weather, including extreme heat, and also including extreme flooding. And so all of these sort of paint the picture for the work that I do. So I started working with Shodagor communities in a small pilot study in 2011, and then more seriously in 2014, conducting the first systematic data collection with these communities. And this has since become what I call the Shodagor Longitudinal Health and Demography Project. It is an ongoing long-term study that is directed by me, but also done in collaboration with my colleagues in Bangladesh, and also a really wonderful field team pictured there. In all of the communities, we conduct a fairly extensive demographic interview with all adults. And this covers things like demographics, economics, health histories, reproductive and breastfeeding histories, contraceptive use, childcare, household wealth. We've been conducting longitudinal data collection since 2017. We have cross-sectional data that has been collected since 2014. We also do a lot of in-depth interviews and focus groups, but these tend to be pretty project specific. We, in 2017, then started conducting interviews with most adults on a weekly or every other week basis, in which we were asking about daily income and childcare, illness symptoms, breastfeeding practices, household expenditures. We did some dietary recall for a couple of years. We collected time diaries from women, and then collected seasonal food security, as well as anthropometric measurements. During this time, we also collected a lot of behavioral data, including a livelihood GPS movement. So we gave little GPS units to women when they would go out trading, and then also gave GPS units to the fishing families and men to keep on their boats. I have conducted scan samples and focal follows of kids under 5. Since 2014, we started collecting, we've been collecting anthropometric measurements, so height, weight, and mid-upper arm circumference seasonally, so every 6 months or so. We have also collected blood pressure. We've done point of care testing for hemoglobin, which is an indicator of anemia, and A1C, which is an indicator of diabetes. And then we've also collected whole blood, which has been assayed for C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation. I want to tell you a little bit about how my field team and I work with the Shodagor communities. So this is basically, we go through a sort of multi-tiered consent process in which we first talk to community elders, as we're doing here in this picture, to discuss a new project, answer any questions, address any concerns. We then hold individual and household level meetings, and at that time get formal consent from parents, from adults for their participation, and also from parents if kids are going to be involved in a study. And then we periodically reconsent people, especially because we do lots of like waves of data collection seasonally. And so before we start like another round of data collection, we'll sort of like informally reconsent them and just say like, you remember what we're doing, and are you still okay with participating? I think it's really important to attempt to benefit the communities that I work with, or that they benefit from the research. I do this by making community and household contributions, attempting to provide test results whenever possible using point of care testing, which is basically like what we do with our COVID tests, right? Where you can swabs, take a nasal swab or a drop of blood and get test results within 10 to 15 minutes, and then do health education around test results. And then I'm also aiming to do more capacity building in the communities, but that's sort of something that I'm developing over time as the longer I work there. All right, so back to the research questions. How do women's livelihoods adapt to environmental change? First of all, there are differences in women's occupations in terms of local ecology and opportunity cost. Using data from cross-sectional interviews that were collected in 2014, my colleagues and I found that the two of the largest and most important drivers of a woman's occupation were the time that she lived to market. So this model here is predicting whether a woman trades or not. So women who work as traders live significantly closer to a major market town. And I'm not going to show you model results for the other one, but women who work as fishers live significantly closer to the Meghna River, which is one of the 3 largest rivers in all of MATLAB, and the place where fishing is most consistently productive year-round. So traders live closer to the market. 96% of women who trade live within 10 minutes walk of a major market town. 71% of women who fish live in these 2 groups closest to the Meghna River here. So ecology and opportunity cost associated with ecology seem to be really important drivers of the occupations that women choose. I also expected women's work to respond to seasonal environmental change, given that there's such dramatic differences in the landscape. And so using some of the longitudinal data that were collected, we examined frequency of work and childcare while working. We were primarily interested first in father's care. The Shodagor dads provide a lot of childcare. Some of them an unusually large amount of childcare. So dads in trading households are providing a lot of care, especially for kids who are around the age of 5 or younger. And this is resulting in seasonal differences. This plus the sort of ecological differences are resulting in seasonal differences in women's work in trading households, such that women who trade are primarily working during the dry season, their husbands are taking care of their young children, and then they essentially switch during the rainy season. Dads go fishing and moms stay home and take care of kids. But in fishing households, there's no significant difference. Everyone is just fishing all year round together. And so these differences really make a lot of sense, sort of in light of these ecological differences that are associated with women's occupations, because if you, during the rainy season, it's extremely difficult for women to go out walking to the more extant villages in the community when everything is covered in water. On the other hand, the rainy season is an extremely productive time for fishing, no matter where you live or how close to the Meghna River you are. And so trading makes a lot of sense during the dry season. Fishing makes a lot of sense during the rainy season. And in these households, people then trade off the work and childcare activities that they do. Finally, we have some evidence that extreme weather is impacting economic outcomes. We don't have any evidence yet that extreme weather is impacting economic practices, but maybe one day soon. So in a paper that was looking at extreme flooding, fishing, and child growth, we examined a period of time in 2017 in which there were 3 extreme flooding events, but I just so happened to be in the field during the August-September flooding event in Bangladesh. And these were really extreme floods that happened throughout South Asia and were extremely devastating to lots and lots of households. They were less devastating to Shodagor households, meaning there weren't deaths or really, really severe negative impacts. But what we wanted to examine is whether or not this was impacting people economically, this flooding. Because when I was in the field and witnessing the flooding, people were reporting that fishing was really bad during this time. They were really struggling with fishing. And so I have been able to leverage the longitudinal nature of the data and isolate the time period of the flooding, compare that to the economic data from before the flooding to during the flooding and then after the flooding. And then we also compared the same time point across years to make sure that it wasn't just sort of like this is a normal thing that happens in August and September. And here's what we found. We found a significant result. The first one is not at all in the direction that I expected, because what we found was that in 2017, people started catching more fish during the flooded period, but they were making less money. And so their income took a dip, but they were catching more kilograms of fish. So we went back to the communities and we're like, what gives? Like, what's going on here? And the men basically said, yeah, we can catch more fish when it floods. There are more fish, but they are the non-desirable kind of fish. No one wants to buy them, so we can't sell them for very much money, and they're not very good to eat. So they were reporting the total kilograms of fish that they caught, but they were making far less money in the market. And they themselves were also not eating much of the fish that they caught because these are not particularly tasty fish. Okay, so we have some evidence that Shodagor women's livelihoods and their outcomes are differing in response to local environmental conditions, also to seasonal environmental conditions, and that extreme flooding is having some impact. And so now we want to know how environmental conditions interact with livelihoods and their trade-offs to influence child health. Okay, so back to the flooding paper for a moment. We established that the flooding did seem to be impacting catch, but also income. And then I wanted to know whether the flooding was impacting nutrition, which was proxied through food expenditures, or growth and body mass. And then finally, I predicted that there would be a linear relationship or some evidence of a relationship that income was affecting people's food expenditures, and that was one of the things affecting child growth. So again, we're comparing this time that the flooding was occurring to other times of the year and across years, but we're also able to calculate seasonal growth velocity as an outcome variable here to determine how much body mass was changing from season to season. All right, we found that flooding was pretty significantly impacting food expenditures. Although again, not really in the direction that I expected. People are spending way more way more money on food during these months when the flooding was occurring than they were at any other time during the study period. And a lot of that money was getting spent on rice. One of the reasons for that is inflation was extremely high during this time. And because so much of the rice crop was being destroyed in Bangladesh, rice prices were very expensive. This is one of their dietary staples. And so they were spending a lot of money to purchase rice, which presumably leaves less money for other things. We also found that flooding impacted BMI for adults and children, but the results for children here are really quite, they're significant. They're also really interesting. This is the flooded period. And then what we're showing here is that children were basically not fully caught up by the end of the dry season. So they lost body mass when the flooding was occurring, and then did not catch up in any sort of quick manner. Sorry about that. The next thing then that we did is we modeled these variables together. We don't find any significant, statistically significant relationships between income and between expenditures on a particular thing, food item, and growth in body mass. But what we see here is a really clear negative relationship, showing that as households spent more money on rice, that body mass for children and adults was decreasing. And so having less income and much costlier staple in your diet seemed to be very bad for adults and children. And that was probably happening for a number of reasons. It's not particularly healthy to have a diet that is almost entirely rice, but if that's your dietary staple and you have to spend a lot of money on that, you have less money left over for other things. So we've shown that extreme flooding can negatively impact fishing, which then leads to poor child growth and nutritional outcomes. Okay, now I'm going to talk about seasonality and how that interacts with women's livelihoods to affect child health. I'm going to bring you sort of back to the theory here for just a minute and remind you the idea is that when trade-offs are low, which is reflected in women's fishing, that should be associated with better reproductive success according to the economy of scale model than when trade-offs are high and women sort of can't do work and childcare both at the same time. What we know from the previous data, though, is that trading during the rainy season, or being a trader, I should say, during the rainy season, is also relatively compatible with childcare because that's the only thing that women are doing. And so you have two instances in which childcare is fairly high. And what has resulted from the differences in occupations, the seasonal differences in occupations, is that we have a really nice setup for a between and within subjects study design, such that you can compare, within the same season, you can compare fishers to traders, and you can also compare traders, the same family members, across seasons, or fishers across seasons, and try to sort of work towards an idea of maybe causality, but something closer to an explanatory relationship between variables. Okay, so as trade-offs increase, reproductive success should decrease. And so basically what I'm predicting, or what I'm expecting to have happen here, is that during the dry season, kids in fishing households should do better on these outcome variables that I'm going to show you in just a second than kids in trading households, because this is the season when mothers are working and providing lower amounts of childcare. And also, that if you compare kids in trading households between seasons, that they should be doing better during the rainy season when moms are caring than they are during the dry season when dads are caring. I would generally also predict relatively similar outcomes during the rainy season between traders and fishers, and then relatively similar outcomes across seasons for fishers if childcare and these trade-offs is the thing that's sort of driving some of these outcomes. So I'm going to examine 3 different but related outcomes associated with reproductive success, which are growth, body size, and illness. And generally predict that, again, we think traders will do better, or excuse me, fishers will do better in the dry season than traders, and that kids in trading households will do better in the rainy season than they do in the dry season. We are going to look first at growth. And so using longitudinal anthropometric measurements from 103 children, we looked at seasonal growth velocities. So that was just change in population-specific z-scores that were modeled here between seasons. And what we find are a couple of different things. First, children in trading families, as predicted, are growing at a slower rate during the dry season than they are during the rainy season, or than kids in fishing households are during the dry season. So dry season is particularly bad for child growth if you live in a trading household, particularly when it comes to body mass and weight, which are obviously related. Just to give you a sense, though, these are not major differences, right? These differences are pretty small. They are predictable, but the effect size is generally small. And so what you have here is you have kids slowing down in terms of their weight gain or gain in body mass during the dry season, but not by a whole lot. We also see that children in fishing families are growing at a faster rate during the dry season. On all 3 anthropometric variables. And you know, this is again not a super large effect, but in some cases you really can see that kids in fishing households are seem to be doing much better during the dry season than kids in trading households. Okay, so what you would expect from that then is that children in fishing households should have overall bigger body sizes if they're growing at faster rates during at least one season of the year. So we're modeling the same data here, but now looking just at seasonal z-scores, and we find exactly the opposite, which is that children in trading families have bigger body sizes. On average, they weigh more, they have higher body mass, and they are also almost certainly taller than kids in fishing households. And so the effects of trading during the dry season is that growth is certainly negatively affected, but body size, we don't exactly know what's going on here with body size. I'm going to talk more about that when I wrap all of these results up together, and you will see why when I get there, because they sort of all go in the same direction. The effect of fishing in season is that growth slowed down for kids in the fishing households during the rainy season, and that they ultimately have smaller body sizes than kids in trading households. Okay, now let's look at illness as an outcome. And again, we're predicting that kids in trading households will do worst during the dry season overall, that they should have more days of illness on average. So now we're using same longitudinal data, the data from the same time period that were collected longitudinally, but we're going to examine symptoms of illness for all family members as our outcome. But that was not entirely true. We're only going to look at kids. Okay. All right, I want to be totally forthcoming here and show you that this is a highly zero inflated variable. So for most kids, most of the time, parents were not reporting days of illness for them. So generally we have a lot of zeros for kids. But again, this is not for the modeling, just to show you, when we take the zeros out, there is actually variation here to be explained. So what we ended up doing was modeling this as a count variable using a Poisson process and using MCMC GLMM as a Bayesian, in a Bayesian model. Okay, this is what illness looks like by season. We have communicable illnesses in the solid line here and non-communicable in the dashed line. And I just wanted to show you that and give you a sense of what was going on, to show you that these results are almost or sort of largely being driven by communicable disease, which are respiratory illnesses and diarrheal illnesses primarily. And we find that in trading households, children have more days of illness during the dry season than they do during the rainy season. Again, this is not a huge effect size, but it is a significant result. We also find that in the dry season, trading children have more sick days than fishing children. Fishing children have like very, very few days of illness during the dry season. And these both together indicate strong evidence for a negative effect of trading on child illness outcomes. In fishing households, though, children have more sick days in the rainy season than they do in the dry season. And so the effect of trading in the dry season is that there are more days of illness in the dry season, fewer days of illness in the rainy season. So more trade-offs are associated with poor illness outcomes. For fishers, there are more days of illness in the rainy season, but substantially fewer in the dry season. And so when we think about all of the results together, this is generally what they look like. And from a life history perspective, this makes a lot of sense, right? You have slower growth for kids in trading households during the dry season and more days of illness. And those two things typically go together. The more days or the more illness you have, the more your growth should probably slow down, especially because we're looking at weight and body mass here. And then we have the opposite relationship for kids in trading households during the rainy season, in which they, that should say fewer sick days, but they're experiencing faster growth. And then you have, again, sort of the opposite relationship for kids in fishing households, with fewer sick days and faster growth in the dry season, and more sick days and slower growth in the rainy season. And so what we end up with is really sort of mixed evidence for a model that expects that the fewer trade-offs you have, the better reproductive success, or potentially the better health outcomes you'll have. I'm overgeneralizing a little bit here, but basically we have some sort of mixed evidence for this model. And so what is driving these patterns that we have? One of the things that's almost certainly driving fishing outcomes and is leading children in fishing households to have smaller body sizes overall, even though the pace of their growth is faster than children in trading households during one season of the year, is nutritional. So counterintuitively, the red dots here are fishers, the blue dots are traders, and what we're looking at are hemoglobin results. And hemoglobin, as I said earlier, is an indicator of anemia. And women in fishing households during the rainy season, when kids are growing at a slower rate, have much lower hemoglobin. And so to me, this indicates that there's something going on nutritionally, particularly in fishing households. Women do in fishing households. I'm gonna assume or sort of generalize from that even though we don't see the same hemoglobin patterns in children during the rainy season, that there's probably also a nutritional deficit that might help explain why they're growing at such a slower rate and ultimately have smaller body sizes. It's also possible that there's suboptimal feeding situations going on in fishing households. In an in-depth interview that we did, one mother said, "How could we be able to take care?" Meaning while they're out on the fishing boat. "Even we cannot eat on time. How could we feed the children?" And then finally, it's possible that heat-related illnesses are driving some of these outcomes. When we work long hours in the rainy season, our children are under the hot sun for many hours every day. This makes them sick. And that's an area for more investigation. There's also a possibility that local disease ecology is driving some of this. So these are not my data here, but this is giving you an idea about what some respiratory patterns look like. The problem with the local disease ecology in Bangladesh is that there are lots of illness. There is no one like sick season. There are lots of illnesses and pathogens sort of circulating all the time. And so it's not clear to me that that would specifically explain why some kids are getting sick in one season and other kids are not getting as sick. In trading households, we know that childcare is one of the things driving the outcomes for kids. So in trading households, they have a lot of help caring for children, including members of women's trading partners who are not relatives, and maternal care in rainy seasons results in fewer days of illness, right here, and also catch-up growth. And so yes. So when moms are taking care of their kids during the rainy season, kids have fewer days of illness. They're also growing at a faster rate. And so the care seems to be driving some of this relationship in trading households. It's also the case that allo mothers or substitute caregivers are buffering against some of that lost maternal care. So this is child growth, and it's faster when dads have help from someone else. Kids are growing at a faster rate, and this is only in trading households, excuse me. And then we see in the illness results that kids are, when an allo parent, and in this case it's a grandparent or an older sibling of the child, are caring for them, kids have approximately the same number of sick days as they do when their mother is caring for them. It's slightly worse if their dad is caring for them, similar to the growth results, but having no specified caregiver is the sort of worst possible care scenario for kids. So this tends to happen most in the dry season and to kids over the age of 5. But in general, kids over the age of 5 also reported a lot of days of illness in these data sets. It's also likely that income or resource variance are driving some of these results. And so if you have a lot of instability in resources during the dry season, it's possible that that could be why kids' growth isn't doing quite as well. Those two things do tend to be correlated. And I'm working with a colleague of mine now to try to model some of the income data over the last 6 years and figure out if the variance in income is one of the important factors driving child growth. One of the other things that's possible in trading households is that mothers who are trading are essentially transmitting communicable diseases to their children, right? They go out into the communities, they interact face to face with a lot of new people every day, and it's possible that they are then sort of bringing those pathogens back into their households, and that's why kids in trading households have more days of illness during the dry season when moms are trading. This is an area that I am currently exploring in a relatively new project in which we are looking at the relationships between seasonal environmental change, social networks, so contact networks and mobility, and the transmission of respiratory viruses. So we're collecting social network data on a weekly basis, as well as illness symptoms and body temperature. And then seasonally, we're collecting anthropometric measurements, capillary whole blood samples, which will be assayed for C-reactive protein, which can sometimes indicate an active infection, especially when coupled with the symptomologies, as well as antibodies, so that we know whether sort of what the pathogen load was in the community during the previous several months. And then we're also conducting collecting point of care rapid antigen tests for influenza A, B, RSV, and COVID, so that we can return results to people immediately. Okay, so we have evidence that women's livelihoods are adapting to environmental change, that this is associated with some health outcomes, particularly for their children. And the next question then is, how will livelihood responses to climate change influence health outcomes? And so this is a very brief section because this is sort of a next steps section for me in my research. So regular seasonality is starting to change. It's becoming much less predictable. But we know from, sort of the data from the last several years that seasonality is associated with particular patterns of illness and growth for children. And as extreme flooding is associated with long-term negative health impacts on child growth, such that children are struggling to catch up in growth once they have experienced a deficit in growth. And so what we expect is that if climate change impacts seasonality and the timing of seasonality, and also if it's impacting the frequency of extreme flooding, that there are going to be predictable outcomes for child health. So we have some evidence that dry seasons are getting much, much hotter. Last year, I think there were several days of extreme heat throughout the year. And temperatures are projected to continue increasing over the next several decades. And the rainy seasons are starting to become shorter and also much less predictable in their timing, as well as rainfall becoming more variable. And so what I'm expecting to see is that as that these regular trading patterns that are sort of inversely correlated with rainy season environmental activity, as trading responds to lengthening dry seasons, that women will be spending more and more time throughout the year working as traders, and that this will have increasingly negative health outcomes for children in trading households. Okay. I also am expecting that extreme climate events like flooding are going to end up exacerbating these effects. So in conclusion, we know that climate change is impacting and is going to continue to impact human health in myriad ways. Given the importance of women's work throughout the world, including, throughout evolutionary history, as well as in contemporary societies, and especially in societies in the global South, and the importance of that work in responding to shocks, that as it continues to shape child nutrition, child health, and well-being, it's really critical to consider the role that women's livelihoods are playing in the relationship between climate change and child health. All right, that is it. That's all I have for you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really fascinating.
What are the women trading?
So trading, they call themselves traders, and they were sort of traditionally trading things, for other things. So now they're selling, and it's household goods. It's like plates, bowls, pitchers, cooking utensils.
Where do you get them?
From the market. So they have a middleman in the market. The women go into the market, get it from the middleman, like fill up their basket, and then they go out into the community.
And so they're selling to women who can't get to the market?
Correct. Yeah. Largely based on sort of cultural reasons for Bangladeshi women who are not Shodagor, in which there are strong practices of purdah. Women aren't really supposed to go out into the communities or to the markets, especially if they're unaccompanied by a man.
And this is why the men can't do the selling, although the kids would be better off if the men would do it.
Yeah, potentially. The women are also really like it. They really enjoy the work a lot. And so given the option, I was telling somebody this in the class, but basically you see women who are married into a household with the intention of never working. But they then get sick of sitting at home, they get sick of sitting there hanging out with their mother-in-law, and they see their friends going trading, and so they learn from their friends and sort of establish relationships so they can also become.
They've got to be the conveyors of information about what's going on in the world.
I would assume so, yeah. Yeah, a lot of them are very sort of smart, quick people. Yeah.
Is there much migration, either permanent or seasonal migration?
There is a little bit, there used to be a lot more. So they are traditionally semi-nomadic, and when everyone was living on boats, they were moving around a lot more, according to them. But the most movement is between the two sort of southwesternmost groups that are near the Meghna River, and they kind of like move back and forth during the rainy season based on fishing opportunities a lot.
But not to urban centers.
No, women are starting to do that a little bit more. So they'll like go live in a city for like a month or so and try to trade as much as possible and make a bunch of money, but then they come home. So there's not a lot of like migration of community members permanently into the cities, no.
Is there a problem of sexual violence for the traders?
There could be a problem of that. That is a risk, which is partially why they say that they go trading in groups. So it's very rare for women to go out by themselves. Yeah, because of that concern.
So you said about 55% of households are trading, 45 fishing. Has that number been changing over the years?
No. So these are people who identify themselves in these occupations. And the reality is that it changes sort of year to year based on reproductive status of the women. So women who are trading will like not work if after they've had a baby, they would not work for a year or two. And so at any given time, the number of women or the percentage of women practicing each of these occupations is probably around that amount. But you have some women sometimes kind of opting out and then opting back in based on whether they have a baby or not.
So it's not really like 45, 55 static, like different households might be in a different mode.
Yeah, and then it's sometimes, this is becoming rarer, it seems, but sometimes when, as a family's kids get older, women might start going to work with their husbands during the rainy season fishing, but that's pretty rare still. So generally, if you're a trader, the main way that you earn income is through trading. And if you're a fisher, the same thing. Even though from day to day or season to season or year to year, what you're actually doing on a regular basis might fluctuate.
Does a husband have any say on whether his wife is a trader or fisher, and do they like not want their wives to go out into the villages without them?
I have only heard of one instance where the husband was like actively against his wife being a trader. And that was because she had a history of infidelity. But otherwise, no, I don't know of any circumstances where they're sort of actively against it. But they say, so when we've asked, both members of the couple, husbands and wives, say that they sort of decide together. But it's largely based around what a woman's mother did as her occupation, but then sometimes after marriage, the couple might decide on a particular strategy and not another. So they say that they make the decision together. So he does have a say. Yeah.
The slower growth trajectories during the dry season for the trading families, is there any difference in the age of the children? As you mentioned, if they're very young, the mothers might stay. But does that also influence the duration of breastfeeding or anything like that?
Yeah, so we only looked at kids between 2 and 18.
Okay.
So we tried to exclude kids who were still breastfeeding from the sample for exactly that reason. And then the way that the Zeke scores were modeled is that they accounted for age and sex of the child. So they took into account sort of normal growth trajectory of kids. Yeah.
Did the Shodagor ask for any sort of education? This would obviously be different if they were at schools with school lunch and things like that, but.
I don't think school lunch is a thing in Bangladesh. I think most kids go home for lunch. Some of the Shodagor kids who live near the market town, it's becoming more and more likely that kids will go to school and stay in school slightly longer. But most of the kids who are living not near that market town are just not going to school at all because they're on the fishing boats all the time. So there's a real variance in education as well. But I don't know that it would change anything about their nutritional trajectories. It almost certainly has an impact on their exposure to pathogens, but we'll find that out, I guess. Yeah. Any questions?
What's the mortality pattern of the kids?
Mortality is really low now, child mortality. Although, I haven't looked at the numbers recently. There have been a number of cases over the last year of infant deaths, which in the 10 years that I've been working there, I have known of very, very few infant deaths, maybe a couple. So there's been a real uptick. I don't know exactly what's going on, but child death and infant death is pretty rare now. In the past, it was significantly higher, to the extent that I think women who trade who are now over the age of 60, I think they had an average of 3 child deaths. Fishing women had an average of 2. So
That seems to be possibly related to what I was going to ask. It seems to be a foregone conclusion that the men are not very good at taking care of the children. What's going on?
they're like,
It's past the best breastfeeding part, right?
yeah, so men are like, what I would say is a couple of things. I would say that the data are showing that men are not as good as their wives, but they're also not that bad. So like children are doing slightly worse when their dads are taking care of them, but the effect sizes are fairly small. And so it's like better to have a dad than nobody. Like significantly better to have your dad taking care of you than nobody. But I did ask a few women about this when I was there last, like a month or so ago, and I was like, so what's going on here? And they said, well, our husbands, they try. But basically if the kids cry, they'll just give them whatever they want to make them stop crying. And so the husbands are like buying sweets and stuff for the kids to eat, and then the kids won't eat their regular meals, basically, which has definitely happened in my home more than once. So.
Do you know if like firstborn children fare any better in terms of like growth and illness versus?
I don't. Yeah, we haven't looked at birth order effects at all. That's a good question.
What about pollution?
Pollution.
Is anybody monitoring that? I mean, you've got all this great data about health status, inflammation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is anybody going to try to correlate that with the increasing pollution in the river?
We could. There are a lot of geological scientists who are measuring taking various measures of water pollution in Bangladesh. I don't know if anyone is looking at the rivers that these guys live on or nearby. I could. I think that there are some relatively inexpensive tests that have been developed recently that measure for particular pollutants. So yeah. But I mean, they're drinking the water, they're cooking with the water, they're brushing their teeth with it, bathing in it. Like it's really, really not clean at all. And air pollution is also becoming a big issue.
I noticed you touched on social networks, but I was wondering if you can elaborate or comment on the household structure. And how that dynamic and whether, fits or plays into social support and and also as it relates to fishing or trade?
Yeah, so most households, because the boats are very small and also the houses that they've been building are small, so they're mainly nuclear family households with parents and kids, so 2 generations. But almost everyone lives in an extended family group, so most people have relatives who live in the group with them. And then those relatives in a lot of cases are the ones sort of helping out with childcare, especially in the trading households. And so one of the main sort of drivers behind the project that I'm running right now is the idea that we all generally have a good sense of now, especially after COVID, how particular environments in the global north lead or affect transmission of respiratory viruses, right? All of us being inside together is a risk factor. What is very, very, very understudied and we know relatively little about is how when people are living generally out in the open, but also when they have these really tight sort of kinship ties, like is common in lots of parts of the global south, but also in the Shodagor, we have no idea how that impacts the risk of respiratory viral transmission. And so that's part of the motivation here, is to try to understand both how seasonal behavioral change is impacting risk, but also how sort of kinship dynamics are affecting it, because people do spend the majority of their time with kin members.
Is this a Hindu group as opposed to Muslim?
No, they call themselves Muslim, but they have a lot of sort of syncretic practices.
Are they, how often do they, I mean, it's only 500 households total?
In Matlab, yeah. There are other households, like other Shodagor throughout the country.
So they are, I mean, that's a small group for breeding, really.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a problem with inbreeding?
A problem with it? I don't know.
How much are they? Yeah.
There's a lot of cousin marriage that happens in the past especially, but that's also sort of common in other parts of Bangladesh. And so, but it's becoming much less common, and people don't seem to have a huge problem finding mates for their kids. But it's really rare that Shodagor people get married to non-Shodagor people, and typically when that happens, it's a love marriage, so it's not an arranged marriage, and the non-Shodagor person then has to come live with the Shodagor communities and are usually sort of kicked out of their own families.
I was struck by how they reject certain fish species when they seem to need the protein. Are those bottom feeders that might be scarfing up lots of toxic stuff, or is that a maladaptive behavior, rejecting those fish?
I don't know. I don't know what kinds of fish those. I mean, we asked, but it didn't stick in my mind. They're just like, they basically say that they don't taste good. They have a lot of bones. They don't have a lot of meat on their bones effectively, and they are not tasty. I don't know what that means. It's a good question.
They should just change their taste.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the other thing too is that what they often do is they sell their catch and then they buy other fish to eat. And I said, why do you do that? Like, why don't you just eat what you caught? And they're like, because we like variety. So, yeah. It might be maladaptive.
Are they strictly monogamous marriages?
No, they're mostly, like, vast majority are monogamous marriages, but it's polygyny is allowed. It's just, I think it's ecologically conscripted monogamy, right? It's just really hard to maintain a polygynous household. And so I think there are like 2 polygynously married individuals currently living in the communities. And not in different marriages, not the same one.
What is the difference in age between spouses on average?
Okay, so again, this is obviously really different based on the, generation. I think the older generations, it was close to 10 years between husband and wife, with husband's older, obviously. And now I think it's much closer to like 3 or 4.
So that's quite large for a monogamous society, actually.
People just don't really worry much about getting their sons married off until they're well past 18.
The sons have to build these boats or something.
I mean, I think there's an expectation that they, demonstrate that they can provide for a family. Sometimes families are waiting because they really want, like the parents really want to build a home on the land or build up their, build another home on the land that their son and his new wife would live in. And so there's some effort to make their family sort of more attractive to potential mates for their sons. With the idea that if she could move into a home on the land as opposed to a boat, then that's a better situation for her. And if they can demonstrate that they have economic wherewithal and she won't have to work, then that's attractive to her parents. Whether or not that ends up being true is, I think, totally unrelated to any promises that get made. But
Okay, thank you so much, Katie.
thank you so much.